We're going to move on to the 19th century and the famine. And then Tom's going to take us through the history of the famine. And then Ellen's going to talk about some of the impact of the famine, and particularly Irish Catholicism after the famine, and how that evolved. And yeah, so I think you'll find that very interesting, and some of the stuff on shame and guilt that Ellen's be talking about. So I'll say no more, otherwise I'll be a spoiler. Anyway, I'd just like to reflect on last week. We basically, one of the things I did was look at the subtle ways that the penal laws unraveled the culture at a family and a community level in a very divisive, centrifugal way. And then James told the wonderful story about Adon O'Rahilly and also Amagin. And then we looked at how the culture or the tradition was dead, but long lived the tradition, how it kept going in various forms through hedge schools and courts of poetry and ashling poems, and just simply the oral tradition is very difficult to kill. But I'd like to go back now just a little bit before we hear from Tom about the chosen people. And we'll look at that for a little while, and then we'll look at the mythology of the chosen people, in particular in relation to their attitude, or the attitude in the mythology to women. So just to kick off, Ernest Renan, the author of a book called The Life of Jesus, says nothing great has been established which does not rest on a legend. And the legend we're particularly talking about is those of the Old Testament. Now, clearly, we're treating them as a mythology rather than a belief system in this particular context. But it is these mythologies that were very central to the English Protestants and the Puritans. They believed the Bible was about them and not just the ancient tribes of Israel. And it was specifically the appropriation of this mythology that firmly established them as the chosen people. Now, the point about these particular myths is, while they exalt one nation, at the same time, implicit in it is the denigration of other nations. They create a sense of usness, a sense of community, by dividing the us from those who stand outside, namely the not chosen people, which of course included the Irish, but in the particular context of the Protestant mythology, the othered arch enemy were of course the Roman Catholics, who were framed as the Antichrist, the whore of Babylon, the beast, and in addition to the Catholic, of course, the Jews. Now, having established that agon or opposition, and decided who your demonized other is, the Old Testament then spells out very clearly what's in store. So chapter 31 of Numbers tells us about the destruction of the Midianites by Moses' Israelites, when they had corrupted the Israelites with pagan practices. All the men were killed, all the married women were killed, along with every male child. And left over were 32,000 virgins who were duly distributed. And you can use your imagination as to what they had, what the Israelites had in store for them. And then if we go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, the Lord thy God delivers the native tribes, and the instruction is, thou shalt smite them and utterly destroy them, and thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor show any mercy unto them. Now, if you look at this in a detached way, it's hard to see that it isn't anything other than a biblical sanction for genocide, slavery, and what might today be described as ethnic cleansing. And by the way, it's all carried out in the name of the Lord, and often at the Lord's instructions. And if you look at it objectively, it's hard to see this isn't anything other than shocking, brutal, and bloodthirsty. And we know that Cromwell and his men went into battle in the Civil War, the English Civil War, and against the Irish with the war cry in the name of the Lord and of Gideon, who was another one of these bloodthirsty Israelites that had God on his side. So when I listen to this sort of stuff in school, it kind of goes over your head. But if you were to take it literally, it's just brutal. And in a way, it sets up a sort of mythic narrative structure that makes a lot of sense when you start to consider imperialism, what the British did in India and in Africa, the role in slavery. And of course, anyone who resists the power of the Protestants is effectively regarded as the Canaanites. Now, later on, this was, in a way, the mythology that was right behind the colonization of America. And in this particular case, the Canaanites are, of course, the American Indians. And the thing that's significant about this is that the mythology behind this is that, in a way, it sanctions the appropriation of lands. And so what might otherwise be called theft is not theft. It's doing what God told you to do. Now, there's one thing in common with these various others, is they were all divided, decentralized, or tribalized societies, and they had a very limited capacity to resist the powerful centralized country and culture with their decentralized tribal culture, who could be picked off one by one. So let's just now look at how in the chosen people's mythology, women were treated or regarded. And one of the things that the Puritans in particular have was a thing about sex. And the particular character in the Old Testament that was the personification of the dangers of female sexuality was of course Jezebel, which is a term you occasionally hear used. You're described as a Jezebel would mean that you're dangerously using your female sexuality. Now, what happened in the pagan religion was the sort of appropriation of Jezebel, but it also was meant to personify temptation, which not only was in relation to sin and fornication, but also in relation to the temptations of other religions, which of course included Catholicism, but also anything pagan. So Jezebel as a sort of sexual threat was one of the few portrayals of femininity in the Old Testament. The other thing, if you read the texts critically, you find that marriage gave the man sexual rights over his wife. She, in turn, had no rights. The woman was effectively male property and was effectively part of the system of ownership, entitlement, and coercive power that we found out in Genesis chapter 1 also applied to the natural world. Rape as a crime is simply not mentioned. A woman's consent is not a matter of any interest. And clearly, in a way, there's this structure of a form of very assertive patriarchal thinking is very prevalent when you read the Old Testament with a critical modern eye. But there's one particular figure that I think warrants particular attention, which is the hag or the crone. And if I've got it there, yeah, here we are. I'll just show you. Bill has just come up with the most mighty hag, which we're going to include in the summer school this year. Do you see her here? Do you see the hag?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a mighty hag. I put it up on Instagram today. It's getting a huge amount of likes. Anyway, the hag or the crone is a very significant figure in ancient Irish culture, as we well know, as Niall knows, because it's the sleeping with the hag or the kissing the hag is an intrinsic part of the journey to kingship. Now, what happened in the Protestant religion of the 17th century is the hag started to be framed as a witch, and this was the subject of cruel persecution. The so-called witch became the subject of what we would now call hate crimes. They were a hated figure, and they were even seen as worse than the Catholics or the Jews because they were the enemy within the community. So while for thousands of years, the traditions of the hag and the crone were very much part of the religious, under Oliver Cromwell's Puritan rule, a paranoia was to break out about them. And witch burning reached a height. And in America, there was the Salem witch trials, where over 150 suspects in Massachusetts in 1972 were tried, and it led to 19 hangings. So the justification, by the way, is given in Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So the hag, or the crone, or that aspect of the goddess that was hugely revered in the Irish tradition and respected, has become an object of intense cultural hatred and victimization, and so much so that as a result of Puritan biblical literalism, it was to grip Europe for 200 years. And by the time it had softened its stance, it had claimed somewhere in the region of 50,000 victims. So while in ancient Irish mythology, kissing the hag was a critical step on the journey to kingship, under Oliver Cromwell, the kissing or the hag was a subject of extreme paranoia. So I just thought that that contrast with the hag that we will be looking at as part of the Bard Summer School, The Return of the Goddess, we have added the Cailleach Bíra, and we will be looking at the hag as a critical part of the summer school, along with those other formidable characters, Macha and the Morrigan and Bridget and Danu. So button up for lots of looking at the hag on Clare Island this year, and in a way doing what we can to recover the hag and the crone from the witch hunts of 200 or 300 years. But I just thought that was quite illustrative of the awful power of the appropriation of a mythology in the case of the Puritans. Fiona's asking, who am I calling a hag? Good one, Fiona. Yeah. Sorry, I am equating the hag with the crone and the hag with the witch. Now, maybe that's a step too far, but I just thought, what is the closest to a hag or a crone but a witch? But if anyone wants to correct me on that, I'm fine. But it just seemed to me there was a huge overlap. Anyway, I just wanted to do that as a catch up and a link and a reminder of what we're doing here, which is a mythic history. And the mythic history involves looking at the mythic structures behind history and behavior. Could
I just add, in Irish, the word for a witch is ban fassa, which means wise woman.
Yeah, well, the wise women, the ban fassas, 50,000 of them were wiped out. And I think down in Kilkenny wasn't the one, Bridget?
Penelope, or no, Petronella.
Petronella, yeah. Anyway.
Kittler.
Alice Kittler.
Alice Kittler.
Yeah. Anyway, we've looked at various forms of cruelty to that were inherent in things like the legislative reforms of the pagan era, of the penal laws and various other things. But for now, we're going to look at another form of cruelty, which Tom is going to take us through. So over to you, Tom, and the history of the famine.